Greetings, weary Tarnished. Set down your flask and let your weapon rest. Tonight we wander through the deepest unsolved mysteries of the lands between, where every ruin whispers of things long forgotten. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from, and subscribe if this helps you sleep. The lands between holds more questions than any grace could guide you toward answering. These are the silences between the lore, the gaps in every item description, the doors that never open, the nature of the Elden Ring itself. Before we speak of its shards or its shattering, there is a question that sits beneath everything else, quiet and persistent. What exactly is the Elden Ring? The game describes it as the source of the Erd Tree's light, the foundation of the Golden Order, a ring of immense power given to Queen Marika by the Greater Will. But those descriptions tell us what it does without explaining what it is. Is it a living thing? Is it a law? Is it something closer to a soul, an identity, the binding principle that holds an entire cosmology together? The Elden Star's incantation offers one of the few direct hints about the ring's origin. Its description suggests a golden star fell from the heavens long ago and became the foundation of the Erd Tree. If that's true, the Elden Ring didn't arise from the lands between at all. It arrived from somewhere else, carried by cosmic forces that predate Marika, predate the Erd Tree, predate the Golden Order entirely. The ring may be a vessel rather than a creation, a container that the Greater Will sent ahead like a seed, embedding itself in the earth so that an entire civilization could grow around it. What that means for everything built on top of it is quietly unsettling. If the ring is foreign to this world, then the Golden Order was never natural. It was an installation, a governing structure imported from somewhere beyond the stars and accepted as divine because no one alive remembered a time before it. The Elden Ring's shattering didn't just break a powerful artifact. It may have fractured the fundamental agreement between this world and the outer god that claimed it, leaving every living thing adrift without realizing the anchor was never truly theirs to begin with. Marika and Radagon, one body and its impossible secret. Perhaps the single most disorienting revelation in all of Elden Ring's lore is the moment you discover that Queen Marika and Radagon of the Golden Order are the same being. The God Queen and the golden-haired warrior who served her married into her lineage, fought on her behalf, and shaped the faith of the Golden Order are not two people in a complicated relationship. They are one person wearing two forms. The game confirms this, but refuses to explain it. How does a single being occupy two identities simultaneously? How did Radagon marry Rennala, father children with her, and then return to Marika's side as Marika's consort when they were always the same entity? Did Marika create Radagon deliberately, splitting off a portion of herself to act independently in the world? Or did Radagon emerge unbidden, a secondary self that developed its own will, its own loves, its own philosophical commitments? The divergence between them matters enormously. Radagon spent his later years desperately trying to repair the Elden Ring, working against the very shattering that Marika initiated. If they share a body and presumably a mind, what does it mean that one half was trying to undo what the other half had done? Some theorists believe the split represents a genuine internal war, two irreconcilable identities locked inside one divine vessel. Others propose that Radagon was always Marika's instrument, that the repair attempts were part of a longer plan whose conclusion we never fully see. What we do know is that the Two Fingers served the greater will and appointed Marika as its vessel. If Marika chose to shatter the ring, she was defying the entity that empowered her entirely. And if Radagon was trying to repair it, then some portion of her was still loyal, even in the act of rebellion. A being divided against itself, serving two masters that happen to share every memory and every heartbeat, doing opposite things with the same hands. The greater will and what it actually wants. The greater will is described as an outer god, a vast intelligence beyond the lands between that guides the course of civilizations through messengers, through the Two Fingers, through chosen vessels like Marika. But the game never tells you what it wants, in terms a mortal mind could hold comfortably. We know it values order. We know it established the Erd Tree and the Golden Order as its governing instruments in this world. We know it punished Marika for shattering the Elden Ring by imprisoning her within the base of the Erd Tree itself. But punishment implies disappointment, and disappointment implies expectation, and expectation implies a plan. So what is the plan? Some theories suggest the greater will views the lands between as an experiment, a test environment for a kind of ordered civilization that it hopes to replicate or perfect elsewhere. Each Tarnished who rises to become Elden Lord is being evaluated. The best possible outcome is being selected for. If this is true, the greater will is essentially a cosmic farmer, and the lands between is its garden. Everything that has ever happened there, every war, every shattering, every demigod conflict, is being watched and assessed and filed away as data. The suffering of every living creature is simply the cost of running the experiment properly. There's another, quieter theory, that the greater will is no longer paying close attention at all, that it sent the Elden Ring and established the Erd Tree and then turned its vast awareness elsewhere, leaving the Two Fingers to manage things as best they could. The Two Fingers communicating with the greater will for years at a stretch, waiting for responses that take ages to arrive, would support this reading. Perhaps the god has simply moved on, the way a traveler moves on from a campsite, leaving the fire to burn itself out, or grow into something it was never meant to become. The Gloam-Eyed Queen and the power that was buried among the oldest and most genuinely unanswered mysteries in all of Elden Ring lore, the Gloam-Eyed Queen stands apart. We know she was an Empyrean, like Marika. We know she wielded Destined Death through the incantations of Black Flame. We know the Godskin Apostles served her, and that their practice of flaying divine beings and wearing their skins was a form of devotion to her cause. We know Malekith eventually defeated her and sealed the Rune of Death away, apparently on Marika's instruction, and then we know almost nothing else. The question of whether she died or was merely imprisoned or was erased from history in some more thorough way has no clear answer anywhere in the game's text. Item descriptions mention her in the past tense, but past tense proves an absence in memory, not absence in the world. Marika's motivations for ordering her defeat are themselves mysterious. If the Gloam-Eyed Queen was another Empyrean, she was a potential candidate for godhood, a rival. But the Godskin Apostles' existence implies she had already built a following, already developed a theological framework around her power already posed a genuine challenge to whatever the greater will intended for the lands between. Some players have suggested that Marika feared the Gloam-Eyed Queen not because she was an enemy, but because she was too similar. Both were Empyreans marked by unusual power. Both represented alternatives to the Golden Order's particular vision of divinity. If the Gloam-Eyed Queen had risen to godhood first, there might never have been a Queen Marika at all. The sealed rune of death, the godskin apostles still wandering the lands between, as if waiting for something, the absence of any confirmed tomb or confirmed death for their queen, all of it points toward a mystery that the shadow of the Erdtree expansion passed by without resolution. Whatever she was and wherever she went, the game seems content to let her remain in the dark. Torrent's history and the Master left, unnamed Torrent, is given to you by Melina early in your journey, and she mentions almost casually that the spectral steed had already chosen you before she arrived. He chose you, not that she selected him for you, not that the grace assigned him as a tool. He chose. That small distinction carries an enormous weight. A horse that exercises its own judgment has a history of exercising judgment, which means it had previous masters. It judged worth choosing, and at some point chose to leave, or was left without one. Melina knows Torrent. Ranni knows him too. Both women recognize the horse immediately, suggesting his previous rider was someone significant enough that their memory endures among the demigods and their associates. But who? The most straightforward interpretation is that Torrent belonged to another Tarnished who came before you and failed. A previous attempt at the journey that ended badly, leaving the horse without a companion and waiting at the edge of the lands between for someone new. If that's true, there is an entire story beneath your story. A character we never meet, who walked the same roads, faced the same enemies, perhaps came close to the same ending, and fell somewhere along the way. Their name and history dissolved by whatever force erases the Tarnished who don't succeed. Another possibility, whispered in the lore forums and passed between theorists like a rumor, is that Torrent once belonged to Melina herself. Her connection to him feels personal rather than administrative. The way she speaks about his choice reads less like a stable keeper reporting on her horses and more like someone describing a friend's decision. If Melina had a body once, and many believe she did, then Torrent may have been hers when she was whole. His presence at your side in this reading is not just a gift, but a remembrance. The Knight of the Black Knives and its true architect. Everyone knows Ranni orchestrated the Knight of the Black Knives. She coordinated the theft of a fragment of the Rune of Death from Malekith. She arranged the Black Knife assassins, and she used their action to kill Godwyn the Golden Soul while leaving his body alive, a state of half-death that had never existed before. What she did is documented. Why she did it and who helped her is where the mystery opens up. The Black Knife assassins were Numen women, the same race as Marika. They had weapons capable of killing demigods because those weapons carried the Rune of Death, a power that Malekith kept sealed and guarded. To steal from Malekith required either extraordinary stealth or access that no outsider should have had. Some believe Marika herself enabled the theft, that the assassination of her own beloved son was not a betrayal but a calculated sacrifice, Marika helping Ranni accomplish something that Marika could not do openly. If Marika wanted to break free of the greater will and shatter the Elden Ring, killing Godwyn in a way that corrupted the foundations of death itself would be one way to destabilize the entire cosmic order she was preparing to dismantle. She loses a son, but she gains the crack in the system that makes everything else possible. What makes this theory unbearably sad is that Godwyn was, by all accounts, one of the few genuinely beloved figures in the lands between. He made peace with the ancient dragons. He was generous where his siblings were vicious. If Marika used him as a tool, she did so knowing exactly what she was destroying, and chose the shattering anyway. Godwyn's endless growth and the rot beneath everything, the death root that spreads through the lands between, originates with Godwyn. When he died the wrong kind of death, his body refused to stop growing. His corpse expanded into a root system that burrows through the earth beneath the entire map, surfacing in catacombs and underground passages and deep caves as something between a plant and a tumor. Those who live in death, the undead enemies who rise from graves and cling to the world against the natural order, emerge wherever Godwyn's roots break through. This means Godwyn's corpse is actively generating a population of restless dead across the entire lands between, spreading a contagion of wrong death in every direction. The question no one has a satisfying answer to is why. What force is driving the growth? Godwyn's soul was destroyed, or so we believe. If the soul is gone, what agency remains? A body without a soul should simply decompose, not reorganize itself into a living root network that spans a continent. Some theorists believe something is living inside Godwyn's corpse now. A secondary presence, perhaps a fragment of an outer god that found an unusual dwelling in a dead demigod's endlessly growing flesh. Others think the growth is a symptom of the rune of death's incomplete application, the stolen fragment that killed him doing something no version of death was meant to do, leaving his body in a liminal state where neither life nor death fully applies. The tragedy is that somewhere inside that vast spreading network of root-like flesh is what was once one of the greatest and kindest figures the lands between had ever produced. Whatever Godwyn was, whatever goodwill and bridge building and warmth he brought to a world full of conflict, it has been replaced by something that spreads decay wherever it reaches. Ranni's Age of Stars and the Journey into Fear. When Ranni speaks of her Age of Stars, she does so with a particular quality of honesty that distinguishes her from almost every other character in the game. She doesn't promise peace, she doesn't promise abundance or safety or the restoration of anything lost. She promises a 1,000-year voyage into fear and doubt, and she says it as if that is the best possible gift she could offer. What would an Age of Stars actually look like from the inside? The ending removes the Erd Tree's influence, breaks the greater will's hold on the lands between, and sets the world adrift under the guidance of the moon and whatever principles Ranni has carried through all of her extraordinary planning. Without the Erd Tree, the rebirth cycle ends. Souls that die no longer return to the tree to be recycled and sent back. They go wherever souls go when no god claims them, which may be somewhere genuinely better, or maybe that absolute void. No one knows, and Ranni seems to believe that not knowing is the point. The doubt she describes is not a flaw in her vision. It is the vision, a world where people make choices without divine direction, without a grace to follow, without a ring telling everyone what order means. Whether that produces freedom or chaos depends entirely on what the lands between's inhabitants do with the absence. Ranni plans to watch from among the stars, which is either the most loving form of faith in people imaginable, or the most convenient way to avoid seeing the consequences of a very long and very elaborate plan that ended with everyone on their own. Placidusax and the god that fled, in a storm beyond time, accessible only by lying down in a specific place and allowing the world to dissolve around you, Dragon Lord Placidusax waits. He has been waiting since before the Erdtree existed. He was Elden Lord in the Age of Dragons, before Marika, before the Golden Order, before the Two Fingers arrived with the Greater Will's agenda, and the god he served simply left. The remembrance of Placidusax states this plainly. His god fled, not died, not was defeated, not transcended, fled. The distinction matters because fleeing implies a threat, and the only thing powerful enough to make a god flee from the lands between is probably the Greater Will itself. The theory that Placidusax's god was an earlier outer god, one that ruled the lands between before the Greater Will arrived to install the Erdtree and its order, explains the abandonment cleanly. The Greater Will came with overwhelming force, and Placidusax's god retreated rather than contest the territory. That's a profoundly lonely image. A dragon lord of immense power and ancient wisdom, abandoned by his deity, not through the deity's failure, but through its strategic withdrawal, left to wait in a place outside of normal time for a return that will almost certainly never come. And the extraordinary thing is that he is still waiting. Across every age that has passed since the Erdtree rose, through the Golden Order's entire history, through Marika's shattering and the wars that followed, Placidusax remains in that storm, loyal to a god who chose survival over faithfulness. His 5 heads are reduced to 2. His sky city crumbles around him, and he waits because whatever else has changed, he has not. The Crucible and what the Erdtree erased. Before the Erdtree's golden light defined what life in the lands between was supposed to look like, there was something older and wilder called the Crucible. The Crucible represented primordial life in its most unfiltered state, a mixing of all forms and possibilities where tails and horns and beast-like features were not deformities, but natural expressions of a world still finding its own shape. The Crucible Knights embody this older order. Their incantations sprout tails, manifest great curved horns, call up aspects of creature and elemental that the Golden Order would later classify as primitive or shameful. The question the game asks without answering is what exactly happened to make the Erdtree's emergence also mean the erasure of this older vitality. Did the Greater Will simply overwrite the Crucible? Did Marika make a conscious choice to define acceptable life forms and reject the rest? The Omen Curse, which afflicts those born with horns and other Crucible features, suggests the rejection was very deliberate. Being born with a tail or horns in the Golden Order's lands between is not just unusual, it is treated as proof of some fundamental wrongness, a child marked for shame before they can speak. Morgott and Mohg, Marika's own Omen children, were hidden away in the Erdtree's roots, their existence itself considered a stain on the God Queen's legacy. The horror of that is made larger by the fact that those same features were once cause for celebration in the Crucible's world. A civilization decided that certain bodies were no longer acceptable and then built a religion to justify the decision. The eternal cities and the sin that buried them, Nokron and Nokstella, the eternal cities, sit beneath the earth in permanent darkness, accessible through places broken by meteor impact or through the depths of the Siofra and Ainsel rivers. They were put there by the greater will, the accepted lore tells us, as punishment for high treason. The cities were banished underground and sealed away because of something they did. What they did is hinted at by the Fingerslayer blade found in Nokron, a weapon designed with one specific purpose in mind: to kill a Two Fingers. The Nox attempted to rebel against the Greater Will's messengers. They wanted to sever the divine communication network that kept the lands between under the Greater Will's influence. The punishment suggests intent alone was enough. The Greater Will does not appear to require an act to be completed before responding to the threat behind it. The banishment itself is staggeringly disproportionate by any mortal measure of justice. An entire civilization, its art and architecture and history and every living person within it, driven underground with apparent meteor strikes and left in the dark forever. Their descendants still wander the ruins of their ancestors' ambitions, maintaining patrols through empty streets, guarding places that have not needed guarding for ages. And somewhere in the ruins, the Fingerslayer blade still rests, undisturbed, as if waiting for someone with the resolve to carry the Nox's old plan a little further. The origin of Destined Death and the cost of sealing it. There is ordinary death in the lands between, and then there is Destined Death. Ordinary death is temporary. The Erd tree receives the soul, holds it in the cycle of grace, and returns it to the world in a new form. This is why demigods cannot be permanently killed by conventional means, why the Tarnished themselves rise after falling, why the world has so many layers of undeath and near death and wrong death. But Destined Death kills the soul itself. It breaks the cycle cleanly and absolutely, cutting whatever thread connects a being to the Erd tree's recycling of life. It can kill gods. It was the reason the Gloam-Eyed Queen was considered so dangerous. And Malekith sealed it away, binding the rune of death within his own body on Marika's command, creating the conditions for the strange immortality that defines the Golden Order's most powerful figures. The obvious question is why the rune existed in the first place, if sealing it away was the goal. If the Greater Will truly wanted nothing to permanently die, why did the Elden Ring contain a rune that enables permanent death? One answer is that Destined Death is a necessary component of a balanced cosmos, that without it, immortality would eventually become overcrowding and then catastrophe, and the Greater Will knew this, but Marika chose to ignore the balance anyway. Another answer is that Destined Death was a failsafe, a mechanism for the Greater Will itself to end things if the experiment in the lands between went irrecoverably wrong. By sealing it, Marika may have removed the Greater Will's ability to simply end the world and start over. Perhaps the shattering was the consequence of that removal, the cosmos finding ways to break without the safety valve it was designed with. Miquella's compassion and the godhood it required among the Empyreans, Miquella of the Haligtree occupies a strange place. Radagon has violent grandeur. Millennia has tragic perfection. But Miquella is described in terms of gentleness, of love that reaches beyond the Golden Order's boundaries, of a desire to care for those the world has discarded. He grew the Halig tree as a refuge for Albinorics and those cursed by omen birth, beings that the Golden Order's civilization considered less than human. He researched ways to cure his sister, Millennia's rot. He tried to develop a form of grace that did not depend on the greater will at all. Whatever his original vision was, it was more humanistic than anything the Golden Order practiced. And then the shadow of the Erd Tree expansion reveals that Miquella abandoned Saint Trina, abandoned the Halig Tree, and walked towards something that required him to shed his own compassion deliberately, to leave behind the parts of himself that made him gentle. The question of what kind of godhood requires that sacrifice has no comfortable answer. The mythology of divinity often imagines gods as enlarged versions of the best human qualities. Miquella's ascension appears to be the opposite, a process of subtraction rather than elevation, a becoming that demands the loss of what made him worth following. What is a God of compassion who has voluntarily given compassion away? What does that entity actually worship, and what does it offer the people who come to it for comfort? The frenzied flame and what it remembers. The three fingers wait beneath Lendel's deepest sewers, in a chamber sealed behind a door that requires you to undress to enter. The ritual stripping of civilization's trappings to access chaos is not subtle symbolism, but the frenzied flame itself is more philosophically complex than simple destruction. It wants to burn everything, yes. It wants to melt the distinctions between things, to dissolve the boundaries between individuals and objects and meanings until everything is returned to an undifferentiated state. But that undifferentiated state is described as something the world has been before. The frenzied flame is not trying to create oblivion. It is trying to return. The two fingers and the three fingers are often interpreted as a divided pair, as if they were once a complete five-fingered hand representing a unified divine principle that fractured into opposing philosophies. What caused the split is unanswered, but the implications of an original unity are significant. If the greater will and the frenzied flame were once the same principle, then the Golden Order and the return to chaos are not actually opposites. They are two phases of the same long process, the creation of structure and its eventual dissolution, cycling through the cosmos the way seasons cycle through a year. The frenzied flame ending in this reading is not a bad ending. It is a scheduled one, and the fingers, both pairs, are just marking time until the calendar turns. The Numen people and the secret they carry Marika is Numen. The Black Knife assassins who killed Godwyn were Numen. The game describes the Numen as a people from outside the lands between, a race sparse and rare in this world, whose origins lie elsewhere. But the specifics of where they came from and why they came are never articulated. What we can observe is that Numen seem to carry something exceptional. Marika became a god. The Black Knife assassins could move in near silence and strike down demigods. The Numen who appear throughout the game possess an unusual relationship with death and with power that feels qualitatively different from the abilities of other races. Were the Numen refugees? Exiles from another land who arrived in the lands between carrying knowledge or bloodlines that made them extraordinarily capable here? Were they sent by the greater will before Marika's ascension, a prepared vessel being delivered to the garden before the garden was ready for her? The game's deliberate vagueness about Numen origins feels like a withholding rather than an oversight. Some part of the storytelling knows what the new men are and has chosen not to say, the way a sentence can be meaningful for what it omits as much as for what it contains. If the new men came from elsewhere, then Marika's godhood was not a native flowering of the lands between his own soil. It was imported, seeded, arranged by someone with a view of the whole pattern, who selected a people and placed them in exactly the right location at exactly the right time. Melina's identity and the eye that opens at the end, Melina presents herself as a maiden without a finger, an anomaly in the Tarnished's system of guidance, a girl with one eye always closed and an earnest willingness to serve as your guide toward the Erd tree. She is warm and curious and seems genuinely affected by the journey she shares with you, but her origins are unanswered. She says her purpose was given to her at the base of the Erd tree. She refers to Marika in terms that suggest a mother and daughter relationship without ever confirming it plainly. And then, in the Frenzied Flame ending, after you have taken the Three Fingers gift, and she has severed her accord with you in grief, her closed eye opens. The flame it reveals is golden and violet, associated in the lore with the Gloam-Eyed Queen's black flame tradition. What that means for Melina's nature is one of the most contested questions in the community. Is she the Gloam-Eyed Queen's descendant? Is she a fragment of Marika, a piece of the God Queen's soul separated and given form as something that could guide the Tarnished without the corrupting weight of a demigod's political interests? Is the closed eye a seal on something she herself doesn't know she carries? The simplest reading is that she is Marika's daughter, in some literal sense, born from the God Queen to serve a specific purpose in the plan that ends with the Erd tree burning. But the simplest reading of almost anything in Elden Ring tends to be the last layer rather than the first one, the Godskin apostles and the theology of wearing divinity. When a Godskin apostle enters a room, it announces something about the nature of devotion that is more disturbing the longer you sit with it. These practitioners killed gods, skinned them, and wore their hides as garments, not as trophies exactly, as ritual vestments. The theology implied by this practice is that divinity can be claimed by the body, that wearing a god's skin is a way of inheriting what the god was. The Gloam-Eyed Queen's followers believed that enough accumulation of divine skin could transform the wearer into something godlike themselves. What makes this uncomfortable beyond the obvious horror of the practice is the question of whether it works. The Godskin apostles are genuinely formidable, wielding black flame with real effectiveness. The armor they wear visibly incorporates divine material that hasn't simply become inert fabric. Whatever the skins carry, they carry it across death. Some quality of what the gods were persists in the removed hide and serves as a kind of stored devotion, a reservoir of the power that the god in question no longer needs because they are dead. If this is true, then killing gods and wearing them is not just blasphemy. It is an extremely efficient way to accumulate divine power without having to become divine naturally. And perhaps the Gloam-Eyed Queen's entire project was always about demonstrating that godhood is not born or granted, but taken, one skin at a time. The Colosseums and the event that sealed them. 3 Colosseums stand in the lands between, one in Limgrave, one in Caelid, and one in Lindell. For most of the game's original release, They were sealed, their doors immovable despite their obvious architectural prominence. The architecture of the Colosseums predates the Erd Tree's current age. The stonework belongs to older construction traditions, the kind found in places associated with the Crucible's primordial period or the Age of Dragons. Whatever purpose these arenas served originally was tied to something that preceded the Golden Order. Some theories place them as proving grounds where champions demonstrated their worth to the ancient dragon lords. Others suggest they were sites of ritual combat, places where warriors voluntarily offered their blood to older gods in exchange for strength. The Landel Colosseum, situated within the capital city of the Golden Order's civilization, suggests that whatever the arenas once represented was incorporated into later society before eventually being closed off. What happened to merit sealing them rather than simply abandoning them? Buildings that fall out of use are left to crumble or are repurposed. Buildings that are actively sealed suggest something inside still requires containment. The closure feels deliberate, institutional, decided at a specific moment by someone with the authority to make it permanent. Whatever occurred in those arenas was significant enough to justify locks, and significant enough to then be quietly erased from whatever explanations survive. The Albinauric people and the creator who vanished. The Albinaurics are an artificial race, created by someone using processes the game never clearly describes. They come in 2 generations that look quite different from each other. The first generation Albinaurics have gray skin and weak lower bodies, suggesting a creation process that didn't fully achieve its intended form. The second generation appear more successfully constructed, but are treated by the Golden Order's civilization as vermin or monsters. Latenna, an Albinauric archer you can speak with at some length, describes her people as having been created to serve, but having been abandoned or turned on afterward. The Halig tree contains a significant Albinauric population, which implies Miquella deliberately offered them refuge from a world that rejected them. But why were they created at all? The Albinaurics seem to have been made and then left without instructions, a people with no origin story they can access and no creator to appeal to for answers. The village of massacred Albinaurics near the Moonlight Altar adds another layer of darkness to their story. Someone hunted them to a remote location and killed them deliberately. The effort required to reach that isolated village and kill everyone within it suggests not casual violence, but coordinated persecution. What knowledge or bloodline did those Albinaurics carry that made their existence threatening enough to justify that kind of dedicated destruction? The wandering mausoleums and the demigods who never rest, great stone structures, walk through the lands between on legs, impossibly tall and slow, bells tolling from their bodies with a mournful persistence that carries across entire regions. These are the wandering mausoleums, the walking tombs of demigods, and they have no interest in stopping. They walk because they were built to walk, because whoever designed them believed that a tomb in motion serves the dead differently than a stationary one. Were the dead demigods interred this way because they were too dangerous to leave in a fixed location, their bodies radiating enough power to corrupt any single place if left there permanently? Or was the walking meant as honor, as pilgrimage, ensuring that the entombed demigods toured the lands they once ruled even in death? The bells suggest mourning, a perpetual announcement that grief is present and moving through the world. No single location gets to keep the mausoleum's sound. It visits everyone. There are mausoleums that contain identifiable remains, bosses you have already encountered, whose remembrances can be duplicated inside their walking tombs. But there are others whose chambers are empty or house unidentified figures, demigods from before recorded history, whose names and stories did not survive whatever cycles of destruction preceded the current age. Those empty or nameless chambers are perhaps the strangest detail. A mausoleum built for someone who has been so thoroughly forgotten that even the building that honors them no longer knows whose grief it carries. The death birds and the afterlife they remember ghostly vulture-like creatures. The death birds appear at night near grave sites and the bases of minor erd trees, wielding death magic with a practiced efficiency that implies genuine training rather than instinct. They predate the erd tree by evidence of their behavior and their association with older death rites. Before the erd tree established its cycle of grace and rebirth, something managed the movement of souls between states of being. The death birds may have been that system's practitioners. In whatever cosmology existed before the Golden Order's arrival, the death birds may have held a role analogous to a clergy, officiating at the boundary between life and death, guiding souls toward whatever came after. The erd tree's arrival made them redundant. Souls now return to the tree, instead of moving on to the death bird's destination, and whatever realm they once served has been cut off or superseded. The death birds are left with no function but habit. They haunt the places where death used to mean something different, and they practice rituals that no longer accomplish what they were designed for, because the cosmic infrastructure those rituals connected to has been replaced by a newer system that didn't ask their permission. They are not evil in any straightforward sense. They are practitioners of an outdated technology, still showing up to work at a job that no longer exists, in a world that has largely forgotten what they were originally for. The black knife armor and the silence woven into fabric. That black armor could silence footsteps is unusual enough. That this silence is so complete that enemies with animal-level hearing fail to detect the wearer's presence at all suggests something beyond simple craftsmanship. Enchanted fabric alone does not explain an effect so thorough. The Black Knife assassins were new men-women with a particular connection to death's edge, trained practitioners of a tradition that the Golden Order's civilization apparently never successfully cataloged or contained. The armor's silence may be a property of the same force that made their blades so effective, a controlled application of the principle behind Destined Death, applied not to killing, but to the presence of a person in space. If Destined Death can sever the connection between a soul and the world, perhaps a lesser application of the same principle can sever the connection between a person's passage through space and the sound that passage normally generates. Presence in this reading is just another form of connection, and the new men apparently learned to break it at will. What the game leaves unanswered is who developed this technique and through what lineage of teaching it passed down to the women who used it the night Godwyn was killed. The armor's existence implies a long tradition of this specific skill, a school or order with history deep enough to have refined and transmitted this particular form of silence across generations. Whatever that institution was, and wherever it operated, it produced some of the most consequential deaths in the lands between's entire history. Rennala, after Radagon left. When Radagon departed the Academy of Raya Lucaria to return to Marika, he left Rennala an amber egg as a parting gift. And Rennala retreated into her library, lost the coherent parts of her mind, and became obsessed with the egg in a way that her students found alarming enough to seal her away in a chamber guarded by their own bodies. She fills the room with the things she loved, performing a kind of eternal revival of happier moments, and she tries endlessly to rebirth something, using the egg at the center of it all. What she is trying to rebirth is never stated. Some believe she is attempting to bring Radagon back, that the egg carries some fragment of him, and she is applying the rebirth magic she developed as an attempt to recreate the person she loved from the remnant he left. Others believe she is trying to rebirth herself, that the egg represents a potential version of Rennala, who was never abandoned, and her obsession is a form of grief so deep it has become a kind of magic in reverse, trying to make the past present by constructing it from available materials. The Sweetings who protect her, the students who shield her with their bodies, suggest that whatever she has become, she is still beloved. Whatever grief did to her mind, it did not make her cruel. She destroys you when you fight her, not out of malice, but out of the same confused protective instinct she applies to the egg, trying to preserve the small remaining world she has built around her loss. The omen curse and the persecution it enabled Morgott and Mohg were born omen. They were the God Queen's own children, sons of the divine ruler of the lands between, and their bodies express the Crucible's features rather than the Golden Order's preferred forms. Horns grew from their heads, marking them as cursed in the theology of the civilization their mother ruled. Their horns were cut away when they were born, a practice described as standard for omen children, a procedure brutal enough that many did not survive it. Those who did survive were regarded as tainted, unsuitable for full participation in the society their divine parent governed. The cruelty of this is layered and compound. The omen features are crucible features. They are the expressions of the same primordial vitality that the Erd tree itself emerged from. The Golden Order's condemnation of omen children is therefore the God Queen's civilization condemning the living evidence of its own origins, rejecting visible proof that the boundary between the Erd tree's approved life forms and the older wild forms is thinner than the theology wants to admit. Morgott, knowing all of this, chose to defend Landel anyway. He protected the capital, fought off demigods, maintained the order that had classified his existence as shameful, wearing a disguise that hid his horns and his nature from the very people he protected. That devotion is either the most heartbreaking loyalty in the game or the most complete internalization of a system's cruelty imaginable. Perhaps it is both. The primeval current and the cost of understanding sorcerers Sellen and Azur and Lusat all pursued the primeval current, the deepest and most fundamental level of glintstone sorcery, the place where magic stops being a tool and starts being a truth. What they found transformed their bodies. Azur and Lusat became crystallized, their flesh slowly replaced by the same material as the glintstone they spent their lives studying, their bodies turning to something that is not dead, but is not quite alive either. still breathing, still aware, entirely encased in the substance of their obsession. The primeval current appears to be a force that does not respond to study passively. When a mind reaches deeply enough into it, the current reaches back, and whatever it sends into the scholar who touched it is something their biology cannot accommodate in its original form. The transformation is perhaps the mind's attempt to build a container for what it has received, the body crystallizing around impossible knowledge, the way an oyster builds a pearl around an irritant. The fact that Azur and Lusat are still alive in their crystallized state, still capable of teaching their spells to someone who finds them, suggests that what they became is not a failure state. It may be closer to an arrival. They have become more fully what they were studying. Whether this constitutes wisdom or tragedy depends on whether you believe that knowing something completely is worth losing the ordinary human form that knows it. The fire giant's sin against the Erd Tree Queen Marika nearly exterminated the fire giants. The mountaintops of the giants are littered with bones of a scale that records a systematic and total destruction, an entire people reduced to a single survivor chained at the forge at the world's highest peak. What they did to deserve this is described as a sin against the Erd Tree in the broadest possible terms without ever specifying what the sin was. The most obvious theory is that the fire the giants commanded posed an existential threat to a tree, and Marika simply could not tolerate a population that carried fire-making power she could not control. Their god, the fell god, granted them dominion over flame, and the Erd Tree is made of wood. This may have been all the justification needed. A diplomatic solution might have been possible. A permanent peace was clearly achievable in principle, but the extermination was thorough, and the surviving giant was chained specifically to tend the forge that could destroy the very Erd Tree that condemned him. He became a prisoner, serving the weapon his people's existence had made Marika paranoid about. There is an argument that the giants' sin was not any action they took, but simply what they were. A people powerful enough to be considered a threat by a god who had decided that threats could not be accommodated, only removed. The cruelty of the single survivor's fate, forced to keep warm the flame that could end everything his oppressor built, reads less like justice and more like the specific kind of suffering that a powerful and frightened entity reserves for those it cannot bring itself to finish. The dragon communion and the worm at the end of the path. Eating a dragon's heart grants the power of dragon communion, access to incantations that let the practitioner breathe fire or lightning, manifest claws, summon the essence of ancient reptilian power. The Dragon Communion Church on the coast accepts practitioners, celebrates their communion, and warns them in the fine print that those who partake extensively will eventually transform into magma worms. You can find the evidence yourself throughout the lands between. Creatures that were once human warriors, still wearing pieces of armor, now enormous serpentine horrors rooting through the earth. The transformation seems irreversible. There is no known treatment, no way to take back the accumulated dragon hearts once the process has begun past a certain point. What makes this particularly interesting is that the game never quite frames it as obviously bad. The Dragon Communion Church treats the practice with reverence, and the worm transformation, while clearly monstrous to human eyes, may represent a different relationship with existence rather than a degraded one. The worms are large and powerful and appear to continue living indefinitely in their new form. Perhaps from the dragon's perspective, becoming a worm is not corruption, but completion, the mortal who communed with enough draconic essence, eventually becoming something more fully dragon than human. The tragedy, if it is one, is that the human who began the journey doesn't survive to benefit from the destination. What arrives at the end is something new, wearing their armor. Millicent and the sisters she doesn't remember, the 4 women you fight as encounters leading toward millennia, share her face and her combat style. They are identified in various ways as Millicent's sisters, though Millicent herself has no memory of family. They fight with a desperate intensity that suggests purpose rather than simple aggression, and their progression through Caelid toward millennia implies they are drawn to their origin in some way that operates below conscious thought. The most striking theory about their nature is that they were not born as people at all, but bloomed. That millennia's Scarlet Rot, interrupting from her body, created biological offshoots that grew into humanoid forms, daughters of the disease rather than of any deliberate parenthood. If this is true, then Millicent herself is one of these blooms, a flower of rot that developed enough individual character to separate from its origin and ask questions about what it is. The sisterly connection between all 5 would then be cellular rather than social, less like siblings who grew up together and more like cuttings taken from the same plant. Their journey back toward millennia would be root pull rather than longing, not love driving them home, but the mycological instinct of something that was never fully separate trying to reattach. What makes Millicent's story genuinely moving in this context is that she chose, or appears to have chosen, to remain individual rather than return, to keep asking the question of who she is, even when the answer might be that she is a piece of something that does not recognize individuals at all. The Lands Between's geographic name, between what this is the most understated question in the entire game, hiding in plain sight in the first thing you learn about the world, the Lands Between. The name implies a position, a geographic or cosmological in-betweenness, existence situated between 2 other significant things. What those things are is never stated. Some theorists suggest it is positioned between the lands of the living and the dead, a liminal territory where souls in transit pause before being recycled by the Erd tree. Others propose it sits between 2 physical continents, real places outside the game's map that the Lands Between is geographically sandwiched between. The most unsettling version of the theory is that the name is cosmological rather than geographic, that the Lands Between exists in the space between what the greater will intended and what the world actually became, a territory held in suspension between the perfect cosmic order an outer god was trying to establish and the resistant reality of a world that never fully complied. In that reading, every moment in the game is happening in the gap between an idea and its incomplete execution, between a god's vision and the imperfect material that is supposed to embody it. The name would then be less a geographic label and more a description of every creature and story within it. Everything here exists in between something it could have been and something it failed to become. The fell god's current state and the giant eye that still burns. The fire giants worshipped the fell god, an entity that granted them power over flame and whose mark they carried as a hereditary curse in the form of red hair. After Marika's genocide, with the fire giants reduced to a single chained survivor, the fell god's condition is entirely unspecified. Outer gods do not appear to die easily. The fell god's power is still visible, manifesting through the surviving giant's eye as a red flame that has maintained its heat across all the ages since Marika's campaign. This suggests the fell god is still present in some sense, still connected to its last remaining worshipper, still capable of expressing its nature through a body that carries its gift. What the fell god is doing with its attention is unknown. The genocide of a god's entire worshipper population represents an unusual form of assault. You cannot kill an outer god with conventional force, but you can kill everyone who prays to it, everyone who carries its mark, everyone through whom it expresses itself in the world. Marika effectively amputated the fell god's presence in the lands between without destroying the god itself. The god persists, diminished in reach and influence, watching from wherever outer gods watch from as the last giant tends the flame and the ages pass, and the civilization that killed its people considers itself the legitimate and eternal authority over the world. The finger readers and the vision that costs their sight. The finger reader crones who decipher the two fingers' messages throughout the lands between are uniformly blind, or presented as such. They see in ways that do not require eyes, perceiving intentions and destinies and divine signals that ordinary sight would obscure rather than illuminate. The spiritual economy that would make this trade makes a certain mythological sense. Direct access to divine communication might be incompatible with normal vision, not because the light is too bright in any physical sense, but because the two modes of seeing occupy the same capacity in a person, and one must yield to the other. The blindness is not a cost, it is a qualification. What makes this interesting in the context of the Golden Order's decline is that finger readers still exist in the lands between's current broken state. They are still practicing, still translating, still reporting on the Grace's direction and the two fingers' guidance. But the responses from the greater will take longer to arrive than they once did, perhaps indefinitely longer. The finger readers may be translating silence now, filling in the gaps of a communication that has slowed to the point of stopping, their blindness having been spent as a purchase price for a product that is no longer being delivered. They do their work faithfully, because faithfully is the only mode their tradition knows, and perhaps because admitting that the god has gone quiet is not something their role allows them to say. The Jar people and the question of who is speaking Alexander the Iron Fist is among the most genuinely beloved characters in Elden Ring, and his nature is also among the most philosophically unsettling if you sit with it long enough. He is a living jar, a ceramic vessel packed with the remains of warriors, and these remains grant him consciousness, personality, strength, and a driving ambition to become a great warrior himself. The question of who or what is actually speaking when Alexander speaks has no confirmed answer. Is there a central spirit inhabiting the jar, using the compacted warrior remains as batteries? Are the remains themselves somehow collectively conscious, a chorus of dead fighters producing a singular personality through combination? When Alexander absorbs warriors to become stronger, He is adding to himself in a way that should change who he is. More flesh, more memories, more martial technique from different lives poured into the same vessel, yet he remains recognizably Alexander throughout. Whatever the mechanism of his consciousness, it is stable under accumulation in a way that suggests either a very strong core identity or a very consistent principle of organization that the remains serve rather than overwrite. The Jars of Jarburg have a leader, a social order, and presumably a history passed between them in whatever way ceramic beings communicate tradition. That history would be extraordinary to know. What began as a vessel for warrior remains somehow became a people with their own customs and philosophy of existence, independent of anything any human civilization built around them. The clean Rot Knights and the devotion that transcended flesh, Millennia's elite warriors, followed her into Caelid knowing they would be infected. They wore their armor into the heart of the Scarlet Rot, accepted the disease as a condition of service, and continued fighting as the rot transformed their bodies from within, organic growths breaking through the metal of their equipment in ways that should have killed them, but apparently did not. The Clean Rot Knights are still active in Caelid and in Elphael long after Millennia herself has entered her dormant state. Their continued function is a medical mystery on top of a military one. The rot that spreads through Caelid kills or monstrously transforms most living things it contacts. The knights carry it and remain recognizably themselves, soldiers with purposes and patrol routes, and the capacity for coordinated combat. One possibility is that the rot chose to preserve them in the way that a more complicated biological system might preserve useful components. If the Scarlet Rot represents a distributed intelligence, as some theories about its nature suggest, then maintaining the knights as functional soldiers serves the rot's territorial interests better than consuming them entirely. Another possibility is that Millennia's own will, expressed through the rot she generates, extends to protecting those she valued most, that her devotion to her knights, even in sleep, is expressed biologically through the disease that connects them all. The rot as love expressed in the only medium available to something that has become mostly disease and only partly human. The Snow Witch and the student she prepared for a long time, Ranni mentions her mentor, the Snow Witch, with a specificity that implies deep and formative influence. The Snow Witch taught her cold sorceries, built her the doll body she now inhabits, and then vanished from the record entirely before the Night of the Black Knives. The cold magic she taught Ranni belongs to a tradition distinct from glintstone sorcery and distinct from faith-based incantation, a third stream of magical practice whose origins are not well documented in the game's lore. Where did the Snow Witch come from? Her ability to construct a doll capable of housing a consciousness implies knowledge of soul manipulation that goes significantly beyond academic sorcery. The timing of her disappearance, before Ranni's plan reached its most dangerous phase, has two natural explanations. The Snow Witch removed herself to protect Ranni from any association that might compromise the plan. Or the Snow Witch died in circumstances related to whatever made Ranni's plan necessary in the first place. If she was connected to older powers that existed before the Greater Will's colonization of the lands between, her disappearance might not have been voluntary. She might have been removed by forces who understood that what she was building, what she was teaching Ranni to do, was a threat that needed to be addressed before it fully matured. The doll she created for Ranni is extraordinary in its craftsmanship and its purpose. Whatever the Snow Witch was, she was someone capable enough to create a vessel for a demigod's soul, which places her in a very small category of beings the world has largely forgotten. The ancestral followers and the faith that survived everything. Deep underground, in the Seafra River and in Nokron, the ancestral followers maintain their rituals. They light pillars of flame according to a sequence that summons the ancestor spirit, a great deer of light that embodies something primordial about the cycle of life in the underground regions. Their aesthetic is what anthropologists would call Stone Age, their weapons and tools dramatically simpler than the technology of the eternal cities around them, their culture apparently untouched by the architectural ambitions and the political projects and the magical arms race of every civilization that has risen and fallen in the surface world above them. They have simply continued. The ancestral followers may predate the Nox civilization entirely. They may have been living in those underground spaces before the eternal cities were banished to them. If so, they watched an entire civilization arrive by meteor, build elaborate stone structures, develop gravity magic and specialized sorcery, commit treason against the greater will, and get punished back into ruin, all while the ancestral followers continued lighting their fires and calling their deer spirits the same way their ancestors had been doing it, long before anyone named an eternal city or worried about what the Two Fingers thought. Their persistence is not stubborn. It is something quieter and more permanent than stubbornness. It is the survival of a practice that was never dependent on any of the structures that fell around it, because it was never built on those structures to begin with. The guidance of grace and the question of whose will it serves golden wisps reach from sights of grace towards your next destination, providing direction in a world full of paths. The conventional reading is that these are Marika's guidance, her plan still operating through the grace that connects the Tarnished to the Erd tree, even in the Shattering's aftermath. But Marika herself is imprisoned. Her original plan has been disrupted by everything that happened on the night of the Black Knives and everything that followed. If the guidance is still her will, it is her will as it existed before her imprisonment, her original routing of events still echoing forward through the grace, like a recorded message playing on a loop after the one who recorded it has moved on to something else. If the guidance belongs to the greater will directly, then the outer god is still actively managing tarnished movements, still selecting for specific outcomes, still working toward whatever the experiment in the lands between was designed to produce. The guidance's adaptability, the way it adjusts to your choices without ever seeming to run out of suggestions, points towards something that is responding to you in the present rather than replaying a fixed sequence, which means something is still watching, still calculating, still deciding which way you should go, and making the gold appear to show you. Whatever that something is, it has been patient enough to wait through the entire shattering and its consequences for the right Tarnished to appear. And it is patient enough to wait a little longer still. The Dung Eater's philosophy beyond simple evil among the Tarnished gathered at the Round Table hold The Dung Eater occupies a category entirely his own. His crimes are specific and ritualistic. He desecrates corpses in a particular way that brands their souls with a curse that passes to their descendants. He is not simply violent. He is ideological. What he wants is to spread his defilement to all living things so that every future generation is born cursed, every soul emerging into the world already marked. This is not the wish of someone who enjoys cruelty for its own sake. This is the wish of someone who believes in a cause. His cause, as best it can be reconstructed from his dialogue and the mending rune he provides, is the abolition of the Golden Order's concept of clean life. The Erd Tree promises a pure cycle, grace and rebirth, and the maintenance of acceptable forms. The Dung Eater wants to corrupt that cycle at the source, to ensure that no version of the Golden Order's pure civilization can be rebuilt, because the raw material for it, clean souls and uncursed bodies, will no longer exist. In his own terms, he is a liberator. He believes the purity the Golden Order enforces is a form of violence against the full range of what life could be, and his response is to make purity permanently unavailable. That this path runs through atrocity is something he has clearly assessed and accepted. He is wrong in a way that costs others everything, but he is not incoherent. His vision of a cursed world is as philosophically consistent in its own horrifying way as any of the endings the game offers. The Siofra River's impossible depth and what lies beyond it. The Siofra River flows far below the surface of the lands between, accessible through a well in Limgrave that descends to a depth that should not be possible given what we know of the surface geography. The underground region it flows through is vast, sky-like in its openness, despite being underground, populated with a biome that has developed entirely independent of sunlight. Where the river comes from and where it goes are questions the game leaves entirely open. Its upstream and downstream points are not accessible. The water simply arrives and departs into darkness in both directions. The civilization that exists beside it has presumably lived alongside this river for so long that the question of its origin has become as academic as asking where the sky comes from. But for the geographer or the cosmologist, the Siofra River represents a mystery of the lands between's underlying physical structure. How deep does the world go beneath what we can reach? What systems of hydrology, geology, and possibly metaphysics sustain an underground river of this scale? If water flows through the underground levels of the lands between with this volume and permanence, then there are vast systems of underground space that the game only partially reveals, entire ecological zones that have been developing in the dark for spans of time that dwarf recorded history. The Siofra River is the visible edge of something much larger that has always been there, unobserved, running its own courses and following its own laws beneath everything the surface world considers fundamental. The bell bearings and the merchants who carry them. Every isolated merchant who sits in a cave or a ruin throughout the lands between carries a bell bearing, a compact object that can transfer their entire inventory to the twin maiden husks at the round table hold when they die. The system is so standardized and so universally applied that it implies central coordination, some authority or institution that issued these bell bearings to a merchant class and ensured that every member of that class carried one at all times. The merchants themselves are isolated, their conversations suggesting lives of waiting for customers who rarely come, patience maintained across years of near total solitude. Yet they are clearly part of a network, their bell bearings connecting them to a central inventory system that continues functioning even through the shattering's disruption of nearly everything else. Who organized this network? The merchant class in the lands between does not appear to have a visible institutional presence. The bell bearings suggest otherwise, suggest a foundational infrastructure that was put in place before recorded history and has simply continued operating because no one came to shut it down. Perhaps the merchants were a deliberate creation of an ancient empire that thought carefully about logistics and left systems in place that outlasted everything about that empire except the systems themselves. The merchants wait not because they are hopeful, but because waiting is what they were built to do, and the bell bearings they carry will faithfully transmit their inventories to the twin maiden husks long after the last of them has sat alone in their cave for the final time. The Erd tree's true age, and whether it has died before. The Erd tree is ancient. It looms over everything, older than any record, older than any institution, older than any being still alive who might remember its youth. But the nature of divine or cosmically significant trees in the game's mythology suggests that what we see may not be the first version of this entity. The Halig tree, Miquella's creation, is intended to replace the Erd tree, suggesting that the Erd tree is considered replaceable, that the function it serves is the important thing, and the specific tree performing that function is not eternal. If the Erd tree can be replaced, it can presumably also die. If it has died before, then what we call the ancient Erd tree might be a much younger tree than its apparent age suggests, a second growth or a third growth from a root system that has been renewing itself cyclically for periods so long that even the cosmic record of the lands between does not contain the beginning. The Erd tree's current state, dying from within as Godwyn's death root spreads through its lower sections, might not be unprecedented. The tree may have been here before, may have performed the same slow collapse and renewal across ages, each time leaving behind a civilization that remembered the previous version as eternal and was therefore completely unprepared for the next one. The greater will might be counting on this. The cycle may be the point. Every shattering, not a catastrophe, but a scheduled reset. Every Elden Lord, not a permanent sovereign, but a caretaker for one iteration of an endlessly repeating experiment. The Round Table holds burning and what the fire means. The Round Table. Hold begins your journey as a stable sanctuary, a space outside the lands between where Tarnished can gather without the world's dangers following them in. As you progress, the hold changes. Eventually, it burns. The fire is not from outside attack. It comes from within, from whatever force animates the hold in connection to the Erd tree's condition. The hold's deterioration tracks the deterioration of the divine structure it represents. When the Erd tree falters and the Golden Order's foundation weakens, the pocket dimension that held the Tarnished's safe house loses its coherence and comes apart. This raises the question of what exactly maintained the hold all along. Was it pure Erd tree power, a bubble of divine protection sustained by the same force that provided grace? Or was it something the Tarnished themselves generated, their collective presence and their shared purpose creating a space that held itself together through a kind of faith? If the latter, the holds burning when Tarnished begin to diverge toward different endings becomes more meaningful. The sanctuary could not survive the Tarnished's ultimate scattering in different directions. The unity of purpose that sustained the space dissolving as each Tarnished moved toward their own chosen ending. The round table at the center, never used for its obvious purpose of gathering equals to make collective decisions, becomes a monument to the cooperation that never happened, the meetings that were never called, the shared plan that was never made, sitting at the center of a burning room as evidence of a possibility that was always available and never chosen. The banished knights and the exile that made them mercenaries. Banished knights appear throughout the lands between, in service to various masters, their ornate armor suggesting origins in an organized military tradition of some prestige. The name tells us something specific. They were banished, they had a home institution, and that institution removed them from it. What the offense was that earned so many knights from apparently the same tradition, the same punishment of exile, is not documented anywhere in the accessible lore. The most common theory ties them to Godfrey's era, to the warriors who served the first Elden Lord and were exiled along with him or after him when Marika stripped him of grace. If Godfrey's entire host was cast out when he was, the banished knights could represent the remnant of that host, dispersed across the lands between after their exile and selling their considerable skills to whoever would employ them. Their discipline and capability survive their dispossession. The training that made them excellent soldiers does not depend on having a home to return to, and so they work for Godric at Stormvale. They guard unnamed fortresses. They patrol locations that have long since lost their original strategic importance, because working is what they know how to do, and because loyalty to employers is the nearest substitute for loyalty to an institution that no longer claims them. There is something quietly dignified and quietly terrible about that kind of competence in exile, skill persisting long after the purpose that created it has been dissolved. The outer gods' uncountable number and the ones we never see. The Greater Will, the Formless Mother, the God of Rot, the Frenzied Flame, and others are documented presences in the lands between's cosmology. Item descriptions reference outer gods in general terms, implying a population of such entities that exceeds the named few. The game deliberately refrains from providing a census. Whether this is because the number is unknown to the characters within the lore, or because the authors found the vagueness more powerful than specificity, or because the world itself operates on a principle that outer gods are definitionally uncountable, is impossible to say from outside the text. What we can observe is that every outer god with a confirmed presence in the game has a different relationship to the lands between and a different scale of ambition. The Greater Will colonized the world through careful institutional construction. The God of Rot spreads through biological contamination. The Formless Mother manifests through blood. The Frenzied Flame seeks obliteration. Each approach implies a different kind of cosmic appetite. If there are more outer gods than these, their approaches might be stranger still, their presences so subtle or so alien that the game's characters have never recognized them as divine at all. Some force that has been shaping events in the lands between for an age, unmistakable in retrospect, completely unnoticed in the moment. The silence around the outer god count is the kind of silence that suggests the game knows more than it is willing to say, and has decided that this particular knowledge is better understood as a horizon than a destination. The walking mausoleum's bells and the morning that never ends. The bells on the wandering mausoleums toll constantly as the great structures move through the lands between, their sound carrying across hills and valleys and reaching places the mausoleums themselves have not yet visited. No one has ever offered a satisfying account of why a tomb would need to announce itself. Tombs are not typically in the business of advertising their presence. They are built to endure quietly and to receive visitors rather than to pursue them. A walking tomb with bells suggests a different philosophy of mourning, one in which grief is meant to be shared with as wide an audience as possible, in which the death that the mausoleum marks is too significant to be processed privately by those who personally knew the deceased. The bells force everyone within earshot to at least briefly acknowledge that someone important is dead and being carried through the world. In a civilization where demigods could reshape the landscape and alter the lives of everyone within their domain, perhaps this enforced acknowledgement was simply accurate to the scale of the loss. The mausoleum with its bells is saying, someone who mattered enormously to the shape of this world is no longer here. You may not have known them. You may have feared or hated them, but they were real and they are gone, and you are going to pause for a moment and know that, whether you want to or not. The bells do not stop. That is also part of the message. Grief of this magnitude does not resolve. It travels. The Carrion Royal Blue and what it carries in the blood. The Carrion Royal family wields blue glintstone sorcery. The Academy's mainstream sorcerers produce magic with a golden tint. The color difference is not cosmetic. It reflects genuinely different magical traditions, different ways of approaching, or perhaps different sources of drawing on glintstone's fundamental power. The Carrion color is associated with the moon, with Rennala's connection to the dark moon, with a school of sorcery that operates through lunar influence rather than through the Academy's rationalist framework. Rennala's children, including Ranni, Radagon, and Rykard, all carry some expression of this moon-aligned magic. Even Radagon, who famously studied gravity magic, does so through a Carrion lens that connects gravitational force to celestial influence. The hereditary nature of the blue suggests that the Carrion magical tradition is written into the family's blood rather than being purely educational. You learn it because you are a Carrion, and being a Carrion means carrying a particular relationship with the moon that expresses itself in the color of your spells. What the dark moon represents in Ranni's lore as a goddess or destination or philosophical principle, and how it relates to the Carrion royal family's long inheritance of its magic, is one of those threads that the game leaves tantalizingly out of reach. There is an entire mythology of lunar influence on the lands between that the surface of the story only occasionally brushes against, a whole alternative cosmology parallel to the greater will's solar order, older perhaps or simply different, watching from the other side of the sky. The Tibia mariners and the fleet with nowhere left to sail. The Tibia mariners navigate boats across spectral water that exists in places where water should not be, their ships sailing on surfaces that have no apparent source or destination. They ferry the dead, presumably, or were meant to before the systems they worked within were disrupted by the Erd Tree's establishment. Like the death birds, they belong to an older model of death management, a cosmology that had specific infrastructure for moving souls from where they died to wherever they were supposed to go afterward. Their spectral boats suggest actual journeys were involved in whatever the original death process looked like, physical or metaphysical passages from one state to another that required navigation and skill and presumably a knowledge of the route. Now they sail on land, over stone and grass, their passengers unclear and their destination no longer connected to anything that receives arrivals. The boats and the mariners persist because the enchantment that animates them persists, purpose outlasting the system it was designed to serve. They are ships whose port has closed, carrying cargo to a dock that no longer exists, moving with the certainty of beings who know exactly where they are going and have not yet been told that the destination is no longer there. In their persistence, there is something almost hopeful if you choose to read it that way. They have not given up on the journey simply because the world no longer provides a destination. They sail on anyway, the way faith sails on when the evidence for its direction has long since been obscured by time. The two fingers' loyalty and the silence they fill with faith. At the round table hold, at the divine towers, scattered across the lands between in their quiet chambers, the two fingers commune. They press their paired digits together and they wait, receiving and transmitting the greater will's guidance across a channel that takes years to carry a response. The interpreter Enia explains this process with the patience of someone who has explained it many times to people who found it unsatisfying. The greater will speaks, eventually. The waiting is simply part of the practice. But the question that her explanation raises and does not answer is whether the greater will is still speaking at all, or whether the two fingers have been sitting in silence for so long that the difference between a very slow reply and no reply has become impossible to determine from inside the relationship. A deity that communicates across cosmic distances cannot be expected to operate on mortal timescales. The years-long wait for a response might be entirely normal by the greater will's standards. The message might be in transit right now, moving through whatever medium divine communication travels through, due to arrive in several more decades. Or the greater will may have shifted its attention entirely away from the lands between, and the two fingers are performing communion rituals in the way a person continues setting a place at the table for someone they have not yet fully accepted will not be coming back. The most disturbing possibility is that they know, that Enya and the fingers understand perfectly well that the channel has gone quiet, and that maintaining the appearance of active communication is itself a function they have chosen to continue performing, because a world in which the two fingers admit the greater will has stopped listening is a world that loses whatever coherence the idea of divine guidance still provides. The lie, if it is a lie, is compassionate. The silence, if it is silence, is being managed rather than acknowledged, carried by beings whose entire purpose is now the maintenance of a structure whose foundation has quietly become imaginary. Rykard and the philosophy of consuming what claims authority over you. Before the god-devouring serpent fully claimed Rykard as its vessel, Rykard was a person with ideas. He established Volcano Manor not simply as a base, but as a philosophical statement, a gathering point for those who rejected the premise that any Tarnished should rise to restore the Golden Order at all. The recusants he attracted were not merely assassins for hire. They were ideological dissenters, people who had looked at the proposition that the lands between needed a new Elden Lord and concluded that this proposition was itself the problem. If the Golden Order's structure was the instrument of the Greater Will's control, then restoring it was not salvation. It was compliance. Rykard's turn toward the god-devouring serpent can be read as the logical extension of this rejection. If you refuse to submit to the gods that claim authority over the world, what is the maximum expression of that refusal? You eat them. You consume divinity rather than serving it. You make yourself the apex by making the gods your food rather than your masters. The serpent at Mount Gelmir offered exactly this: the power to devour what had previously demanded worship. Whether Rykard fully understood what he was agreeing to when he offered himself as the serpent's host is another question. The Rykard you fight is something shared between a man and a god of consumption, the human parts still audible in the way he speaks, the serpent parts evident in everything else. Whatever philosophy he arrived with, he is now the argument made flesh, a being that consumed gods and was also consumed in the process. The final result is less a victory over divine authority and more a demonstration of what happens when two appetites try to inhabit the same body without either one winning. The golem archers and the civilization that built for permanence. Some golems that guard roads and important approaches in the lands between do not simply swing weapons. They manifest arrows. The ammunition materializes in the moment of need and ceases to exist when no longer required, which solves the obvious logistical problem of a permanent guardian that cannot be resupplied. No one is coming back to restock the arrows. The civilization that built these constructs knew this from the beginning and solved for it. What this tells us about that civilization is less about the specific enchantment and more about the thinking behind it. These were builders who designed for scenarios in which they themselves would not be present, who looked at the life expectancy of an institution and engineered around it declining to nothing, who asked the question, if no one who remembers why this guardian was placed here is ever around to maintain it, can it still do its job? And then answered yes, if you design it that way. The golems still stand at their posts. The civilization that placed them is entirely gone. The arrows still materialize for enemies that the original builders never anticipated in defense of whatever has accumulated around the locations that were once considered worth guarding. There is a philosophical humility embedded in that design, a recognition by the builders that their understanding of what needed protection might be temporary, but that the protection itself could be made permanent. They deferred to a longer timeline than the one they could personally see, and the result is constructs that have outlasted every human institution that ever claimed authority over the same ground they guard. Mohg's dynasty and the god he loved, Mohg, Lord of Blood, established his underground palace in a space that feels detached from the rest of the lands between's geography, a realm of perpetual blood-soaked twilight, accessible only through specific portals. He worshipped the Formless Mother, an outer god associated with blood and birth and something that operates beyond the tidy structures the greater will established. The formless mother granted him blood magic, and with it he built a religion and a dynasty in the only location available to him after his origins as an omen child condemned him to the sewers and the shadows. The question that Mohg's story raises, beneath the violence and the blood and the genuinely unsettling ritual context, is what he actually wanted. His plan involved Miquella, who he had cocooned and was attempting to raise to godhood so that Miquella could become his consort in a divine dynasty that the formless mother would bless. This is an ambition so specific and so strange that it requires a kind of sustained devotion most people never achieve, even for things that are actually good for them. Mohg was devoting his entire existence, all the power the formless mother had given him, all the followers he had attracted, all the architectural ambition of his underground palace, to the creation of a divine marriage with someone who had not consented to it and was, in fact, sleeping in a cocoon specifically to avoid being available for this plan. The tragedy of Mohg is not that he was evil. The tragedy is that the only framework he had for love was one that could not accommodate another person in his autonomous existence, and he poured everything he had into it anyway. The Scarlet Rot, and the question of whether it thinks millennia spread Scarlet Rot when she bloomed, and the rot that claimed Caelid has a quality that occasionally feels less like a spreading chemical reaction and more like a directed intelligence. It does not simply infect everything equally. It seems to concentrate in patterns. It preserves certain kinds of life while dissolving others. The kindred of rot appear adapted to it, thriving in the lake and the rotted fields in ways that suggest either they were always suited to this environment or the environment shaped itself around them. The clean rot knights remain functional despite full infection, which requires either extraordinary personal constitution or some form of preferential treatment by the rot itself. If the god of rot is a genuine outer god, and not simply a metaphor for a spreading biological disaster, then the scarlet rot throughout Caelid is not a contamination event. It is an arrival, the god expressing itself through biological medium, the way the greater will expresses itself through the Erd tree. Every rotted tree and poisoned pool and infected creature would then be a part of the god's body, or at minimum, an extension of its presence in the world. Millennia would not have been a vector for a mindless plague. She would have been a willing or unwilling vessel for a deity that used her moment of vulnerability to establish a permanent foothold in the lands between. The rot does not simply spread, it settles, it takes root. It makes the landscape into something that suits a particular kind of life at the expense of all other kinds. That is not chemistry, that is policy. The rune of death's relationship to balance in the world without it. When Malekith sealed Destined Death, he did so on Marika's instruction, and the result was an era in which nothing could permanently die. Demigods persisted beyond what any mortal framework could accommodate. The Tarnished rose from death again and again, because the mechanism for permanent death had been removed from operation. The world became full of the accumulated weight of things that could not end. The death root spreading from Godwyn is one consequence. The proliferation of those who live in death is another. The inability of the lands, between civilizations, to manage succession, conflict resolution, or even the basic cycle of generations in a normal way is a third. A world without the mechanism for permanent death is a world in which nothing can truly conclude, in which every conflict drags on because the losers never fully lose, in which every dynasty is haunted by the previous one because its founders never fully departed. Marika may have believed this was a gift. Eternal life for the gods, extended existence for the demigods, a civilization that could accumulate wisdom and achievement without losing everything to mortality's interruptions. What it actually produced was stasis and then catastrophe, the shattering being, in some sense, the world finding a workaround for the stuck mechanism, achieving through violence and chaos what the sealed rune could no longer achieve through its intended operation. The lands between needed things to end. It needed permanent conclusions. Without them, everything simply accumulated until the weight of unresolved history broke the structure holding it. Fia's practice and what it means to embrace death. Fia, the deathbed companion, embraces warriors and drains their vigor in the process, spreading death influence through a practice she treats with the solemnity of a sacred duty. She is the last practitioner of a tradition the Golden Order suppressed, a person who believes that death should be welcomed and assisted rather than feared and delayed. Her theology is rooted in a cosmology where death is not the enemy, but the passage, where helping someone die well is an act of profound service. The Golden Order hunted practitioners like her, which from the Golden Order's perspective makes perfect sense. A civilization built on the premise that the Erd Tree's rebirth cycle is the appropriate relationship between souls and existence would find a tradition dedicated to embracing death ideologically threatening. Fia represents the old way, the acknowledgement that permanent departure from the world might be the right outcome for some beings at some times, that not every soul is meant to cycle endlessly through the Erd Tree's machinery. Her quest involves the curse mark of death and the mending rune of the Death Prince, and she is ultimately trying to give Godwyn a real death, to grant him what the Knight of the Black Knives denied him, and what his endless root-like corpse growth suggests he has been trying to achieve in his own terrible way ever since. Whether she succeeds, and whether what she does constitutes kindness or intervention, is one of the endings the game offers, quietly, without fanfare, the way most acts of genuine mercy operate in the world. The smithing Master Hewg and the crime that earned eternal service. At the Round Table Hold, the blacksmith Hewg forges weapons for the Tarnished, while imprisoned there by Queen Marika herself. He does not know what crime he committed. His memories of whatever act earned him this sentence have been suppressed or removed, leaving him with only the punishment and the task that the punishment requires. Marika condemned him to forge a weapon capable of killing a god, which tells us several things simultaneously. She wanted the weapon. She considered Hewg skilled enough to create it, and she considered whatever he did serious enough to warrant binding him to this service, as penance rather than simply executing him. The suppression of the memories is the most interesting detail. Hewg is not punished with the knowledge of what he did and the guilt that would accompany that knowledge. He is punished in ignorance, doing his service without the framework that would give it meaning as atonement. This could be cruelty, denying him the internal resolution that understanding might provide. Or it could be something else, Marika removing the memory specifically so that Hewg's service would be untainted by whatever complex emotions knowing the truth might produce. A smith who hates himself for his crime might rush the work or produce compromised weapons. A smith who simply does not know why he is there forges because forging is what he does, cleanly and without the interference of old grief. The weapon he was condemned to create, the one that could kill a god, may have been intended to kill Marika herself, in which case the imprisonment is not punishment for a crime against the order. It is containment of the only person capable of completing a very specific project that a very complicated god queen may have wanted to exist in the world. The Volcano Manor's Iron Maidens and the teleportation nobody asked for inside Volcano Manor, ornate torture devices known as Iron Maidens, wait in corridors and chambers, their hinged casings shaped like elongated human figures. When they close around you, they do not simply damage you, they teleport you. The destination varies, but the mechanism is consistent. Close the Iron Maiden around a victim, and they vanish, reappearing somewhere else entirely. This is not a feature you would design into a torture device. Torture devices are meant to keep their subjects present and accessible. A torture device that removes the subject from the room defeats its own purpose if the purpose is torture, which suggests that Iron Maidens were never primarily torture devices at all. Their threatening appearance may be incidental, the natural aesthetic of a device built for something else that happens to look like an instrument of punishment. The teleportation function points toward a transport application, a means of moving people from one location to another without their willing participation. Capture and relocate. Bring individuals from scattered locations to Volcano Manor without requiring them to find it, or distribute them from Volcano Manor to other destinations as needed. Rykard's operation involved recruiting across the lands between, identifying Tarnished with particular qualities, and bringing them in. A teleportation device disguised as furniture would accomplish this quietly and efficiently. The people transported would experience arrival as emergence from a torture device, which would immediately communicate something about the nature of their new situation without a single word being spoken. The design is either incidentally menacing or deliberately so. Either way, it works. The giant skeletons of Caelid and the scale of something we missed, scattered through Caelid, embedded in the rotted landscape, like geological features that have been there longer than the rot itself, are bones, not human-scale bones, not even giant-scale bones in the sense of the fire giants. Bones of a scale that makes the fire giants look modest, skulls and rib cages so enormous that the landscape accommodates them the way a plain accommodates a mountain, as features rather than objects. These bones belong to something no item description identifies, no NPC mentions, no quest line acknowledges. They are simply there, in Caelid, vastly larger than any creature the game's lore explicitly discusses. The silence around them is extraordinary. In a game that provides item description context for almost every curiosity in its world, the absence of any explanation for these colossal remains is either an oversight or a deliberate withholding of something the game considers better left unexplained. The most common theories connect them to the Age of Dragons, proposing that the great worms of the oldest eras were vastly larger than the dragons you encounter in the game's present, and that these bones are what remained when beings of that original scale died in the distant past. Others propose they were primordial giants, the first inhabitants of the lands between, beings from an age before even the Crucible, whose existence preceded everything the game discusses as history. The fact that they are in Caelid, Radagon's territory, the place where gravity magic was most prominently practiced, has given rise to the theory that Radagon's fascination with the stars and with the gravitational forces that move vast masses through space was connected to these remains, that he was studying the bones of something enormous to understand how such a thing had moved and held together, and finding in that study the principles that became his art, the invisible teleporters of the consecrated snowfield, and who placed them there. Moving through the consecrated snowfield toward the Hewg tree requires navigating an environment that has been deliberately made difficult to traverse. The blizzard reduces visibility to almost nothing. The terrain is featureless enough that orientation becomes a skill in itself, and then, scattered invisibly through specific areas of the snowfield, are teleportation traps. Step on one without knowing it is there, and you arrive, without transition, in the Cave of the Forlorn, a cul-de-sac that requires you to fight your way back out before resuming your journey. The traps are not random. They are placed at specific points that intercept the most natural paths toward the Hewg tree, suggesting they were installed deliberately by someone who understood the geography and knew where travelers would walk. Miquella wanted people to reach his refuge. He built the Hewg tree as a sanctuary for the excluded. It seems counterproductive for him to also install teleportation traps that intercept people trying to reach it, which suggests someone else placed the traps after Miquella had already retreated into his cocoon to prevent or discourage the very arrivals he had originally intended to welcome. The Golden Order had motivation to prevent the Hewg tree from functioning as a refuge, a sanctuary for Albinorics and Omenborn and others. The Order rejected represented a living refutation of the Order's theology. Trapping the approach so that only the most persistently skilled or forewarned could navigate it would effectively seal Miquella's refuge without the public relations cost of openly attacking a demigod's charitable project. Morgoth's hidden identity and the deception that held a city together. For most of his reign protecting Leyndell, Morgoth went by the name Margit. He presented himself as a powerful wanderer, a hostile stranger who repelled the challengers from the capital, rather than as the Omen King, who was the only legitimate authority remaining in the Golden Order's seat of power. This disguise was not a cosmetic one. It required actively concealing the horns that marked him as Omen, wearing armor that hid his nature, interacting with a civilization that would have responded to the truth of his identity with the same theological horror that had condemned his existence from birth. He protected the very people and institutions that classified him as cursed. He maintained the order that had put his horns in a box and decided he should not exist. The philosophical complexity of this is worth sitting with. Morgoth's decision to protect Leyndell, knowing what Leyndell thought of him, is either the deepest form of civic devotion or a kind of tragedy so complete that it has wrapped back around to something almost noble. He did not need the city's approval. He did not require its acknowledgement or its gratitude. He simply believed the capital should not fall, and he was powerful enough to prevent it from falling, and so he did. Whether this represents a man who had transcended the damage done to him and arrived at something genuinely selfless, or a man so thoroughly conditioned by the order that condemned him that he could not imagine withdrawing his protection, even knowing exactly what it thought of him, is a question the game asks very quietly while you stand over his defeated form and read the item descriptions he leaves behind. The Finger Reader Crone's distributed network and what they share Finger Reader Crones appear throughout the lands between, stationed at sites of grace, offering their interpretations of the Two Fingers messages to any Tarnished who asks. They are not identical, exactly. They have individual names and individual placements and slightly different areas of emphasis in what they communicate. But they share the blindness, the robes, the method. They constitute a profession, an institution that trained practitioners and distributed them to specific locations with some consistency of approach. How this institution communicated across distance, how its members maintained a shared interpretive framework when the god they were interpreting apparently communicated only very slowly, is unanswered. Perhaps the Finger Readers share information through their communion with the Two Fingers directly, their collective blindness giving them access to a shared channel that individual sighted scholars would not be able to perceive. Each crone taps into the same source and compares notes in a way the game doesn't show you, but implies through their consistency. Or perhaps the training was thorough enough to create a shared interpretive tradition that doesn't require ongoing coordination, the way separate doctors trained at the same school will reach similar diagnoses without calling each other. The institution's existence implies a period of stability during which it was founded and a period of active maintenance during which it was preserved. What's left now in the lands between's post-shattering state are the individuals who outlasted the institution, practicing alone, in rotations or with diminishing contact with any central authority, serving a function whose infrastructure has degraded while its practitioners have not. The perfumer Trisha and the catacombs she chose not to leave. In the unsightly catacombs, you find perfumer Trisha, an enemy whose presence in that specific tomb raises questions about personal history that the game provides no direct answers to. Perfumers as a tradition are almost extinct, their craft requiring rare materials and specialized education that the Shattering's disruption of supply chains and institutions has made nearly impossible to maintain. For a perfumer to be found in a remote catacomb, fighting defensively rather than adventuring, suggests either that she is guarding something specifically located there, or that she is waiting for something or someone specifically connected to that place. Catacombs hold the dead. The dead in the lands between are often still present in meaningful ways, not simply as physical remains, but as spirits or echoes or things that require tending. If Trisha's reason for staying is personal rather than professional, she represents a member of a dying tradition choosing to spend her remaining time in a place that means something to her at the cost of everything her craft could have been doing in the world. The perfumer tradition that trained her is fading. Her presence here rather than somewhere her skills would be more broadly useful implies that whatever is in that catacomb matters more to her than the profession she spent years learning. The game does not tell you who is buried there, or what promise she may have made, or whether the thing she is waiting for will ever come. It simply shows you a woman in combat armor, smelling of rare compounds, defending something she chose over everything else. The Clean Rot Knight formation and the military discipline that outlived its general, the Clean Rot Knights, maintain formations. They patrol in coordinated patterns. They respond to intrusion with tactical awareness that suggests training so deeply absorbed that it operates independently of any conscious command structure. Millennia is asleep inside her cocoon in Elphael, and yet her knights continue to function as a military unit, not as individual survivors doing what makes sense for them, but as a force with shared protocols and maintained discipline. This requires either that the knights are being directed by something that is not Millennia's sleeping will, or that the training was sufficiently complete that the formations and patrol routes operate from memory rather than instruction. Military discipline of this quality is the result of years of drilling, the patterns becoming automatic enough that the soldiers execute them the way the body executes breathing, without needing the brain to issue a specific instruction for each breath. The rot may have contributed to this, the disease that connects them all perhaps sustaining a kind of distributed memory of what they are supposed to do, each knight's infected body carrying the same programmed behaviors that the disease encountered when it took up residence in a soldier trained to maintain those specific behaviors. If the rot preserves the patterns it finds when it infects a host, then Millennia's knights are not simply fighting because they are determined to. They are fighting because they are made of the memory of fighting, and the rot that runs through all of them has preserved that memory with the same fidelity that it preserved their bodies. Changed but not diminished, wrong but somehow still entirely functional. The crucible of life and the question of what the Golden Order actually lost. The crucible represented the chaotic mixing of primordial life, the state of biological possibility before the Erd Tree's order sorted creatures into acceptable and unacceptable categories. The Crucible Knights were its guardians, their incantations manifesting the features the Golden Order had decided to classify as primitive: tails, horns, scales, the hybrid aspects of creatures that hadn't yet been resolved into stable species. What the Crucible's loss meant for the Lands Between's biological diversity is something the game only hints at. The Golden Order produces a world in which certain forms are permitted and others are condemned. The Omen are born with the Crucible's features and are classified as cursed. The dragons that once coexisted with humanity are increasingly hunted for their hearts. The primordial creatures of the oldest ages are found only in ruins and underground spaces, pushed out of the surface world by a civilization that decided their existence was incompatible with the New Order. The Lands Between's ecology under the Golden Order is a managed one. The Erd Tree's light sustains specific forms of life, and the institutional structures of the civilization reinforce which forms are tolerated. What was lost when the Crucible was superseded was not just the aesthetic of tails and horns, but the principle behind it, the idea that life expresses itself in combinations and variations and unexpected forms that a civilization has no authority to classify as acceptable or unacceptable. The Golden Order is tidy. The Crucible was not. The tidiness has a cost that the game spends enormous effort making you feel without ever stating directly. The Deathbird's original congregation and the rites they no longer complete. Deathbird enemies appear consistently near grave sites and minor erd trees, enormous spectral vultures wielding death magic. They appear at night exclusively, suggesting they operate within a cosmological time frame connected to darkness and transition rather than the daytime world of the erd tree's golden light. Their association with death magic that precedes the erd tree's current form implies they served a pre-erd tree cosmological function, officiating at transitions between states of being that the current system no longer acknowledges. What their original rites looked like, what they actually did when death worked differently, is entirely undocumented. The game provides you with their current state, but not their history. A creature still performing the motions of a ritual whose meaning has been deleted from the world it inhabits is a particular kind of pathos. The Deathbirds know the shapes of their practice. They know to appear at dusk and to gather near places where the dead accumulate. They know the movements of their death magic, but the machinery those movements were designed to engage with is gone. The souls that were supposed to pass through their rites are going elsewhere, returned to the erd tree, or lingering as undead because nothing completes them properly, and the Deathbirds continue showing up at the appointed hours, performing the appointed gestures toward an audience that either isn't there or doesn't know it's supposed to respond. They are a liturgy without a congregation, a ceremony that has outlived every person and every condition that once gave it meaning. Ranni's doll and the question of what she gave up to inhabit it. When Ranni's flesh and blood body was killed on the night of the Black Knives, her soul transferred into the doll that the Snow Witch had prepared. The doll is a remarkable object. It has 4 arms, extraordinary craftsmanship, the capacity to house a demigod's consciousness, and to allow that consciousness to continue operating in the world. Ranni inhabits it with apparent ease, moving, gesturing, expressing emotion, pursuing a decades-long plan that requires consistent identity and memory across a period of enormous stress and change. But the question of what was lost in the transfer is worth asking. A soul that inhabits a body grows into that body's particular affordances. The sensory experience of having flesh, the proprioceptive sense of your own weight and warmth, the ways in which biological processes shape mood and attention and desire, all of this was part of Ranni before the transfer. What she inhabits now has no temperature, no hunger, no fatigue in the biological sense, no pain in any way a nerve ending produces it. The doll's 4 arms and its porcelain stillness are not just aesthetic details, they are the conditions of a fundamentally different relationship to existing in the world. Ranni's plan for an age of stars, her desire for a voyage into fear and doubt, her willingness to leave behind the certainties of the Golden Order's managed cosmology, makes a different kind of sense if you consider that she has already been living for decades in a body that denies her every certainty that flesh typically provides. She knows how to exist without the comforts that embodied life offers, because she has been doing exactly that since the night she chose to let her body die. The ancient dragon's red lightning and what it indicates about their god, the ancient dragons that appear in the lands between, particularly those associated with Farum Azula and the storm-swept realm beyond time where Placidusax waits, wield red lightning rather than the golden or white lightning of later mythologies. This color distinction is not cosmetic. Red lightning belongs to the old dragons, to the era before the Erd Tree, to a cosmological power that preceded and was apparently superseded by whatever force the greater will introduced. Placidusax's own power uses this red lightning, cracking across the storm that surrounds his realm in arcs that feel qualitatively different from the Erd Tree's gold. The color of a cosmological power tells you something about its source. The Erd Tree's gold is associated with the greater will's order, the sun-like warmth of a deity that arrived and flooded the world with a particular kind of divine light. The ancient dragon's red suggests a different source, an older fire, the power that their fled god granted before the greater will arrived and changed what divine power meant in this region of the cosmos. If the fled god was itself a lightning deity, a god of storms and atmospheric power that the ancient dragons served, then the red lightning is literally the expression of that god's nature channeled through its most devoted followers. And the fact that it persists in Placidusax, that he still commands it after ages of abandonment, suggests that the connection between the Dragon Lord and his god was not severed by the god's departure. He still carries the red lightning. He still waits. The power his god gave him is still real in him, even if the god that gave it no longer answers. The godfrey shade before Morgoth's arena and the ghost of a first king. Before you fight Morgoth in the Erd Tree Sanctuary, you encounter a golden shade of Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, standing at the approach to the arena. It speaks to you. It acknowledges your status as tarnished. It tests you, and then it disperses, having served whatever purpose prompted its appearance at this specific threshold. How this shade exists and what sustains it are questions without clear answers. The most straightforward reading is that it is a fragment of Godfrey's consciousness left behind when he was exiled, a piece of the first Elden Lord that could not bring itself to leave the seat of his power when the rest of him was stripped of grace and cast out of the lands between. The capital was Godfrey's achievement, his signature on the world. Losing it was the defining wound of his existence. Perhaps the fragment that lingered is the part of him that refused to lose it, the pride of the warrior king persisting as a threshold guardian when the man himself was forced to wander. Another reading suggests the Erd Tree itself created the shade, generating a simulacrum of its first lord as a test mechanism for aspirants who seek to reach the throne. The tree, in this interpretation, takes things that mattered and preserves useful aspects of them, not for sentimental reasons, but because a guardian that carries the memory and power of the first Elden Lord is more effective at filtering unworthy challengers than a generic obstacle would be. Either way, Godfrey stands there still, in some sense. The first Elden Lord, reduced to a threshold test, still performing his ancient function of deciding who is worthy to approach the seat of power he built. The twinned armor and the brothers who share a body D, hunter of the dead, guards the lands between against those who live in death, creatures that persist in the world after their proper time has passed. His twin brother exists as the other half of a shared existence, one of them at a time inhabiting physical form, while the other waits in a spectral state. Their twinhood goes beyond biology into something metaphysical, a shared existence that defies the ordinary expectation that a body is the property of a single soul. The armor sets they wear are nearly identical. The implication is that the armor itself accommodates both of them, that whoever inhabits the body wears the same suit, the equipment becoming continuous across the exchange, in a way the individual souls are not. What this means for identity is an open question the game poses without pretending to resolve. When D acts, is he acting as D, or is the combined expression of two brothers sharing one body's momentum through the world? When his twin acts, does the body carry D's memories of what it has done in the world, or do they switch into a kind of selective amnesia? The fact that one can apparently die while the other survives implies that they are genuinely separate, not simply two expressions of one soul, but the nature of their sharing, the mechanism by which two real people alternate through one physical existence, has no description anywhere in the accessible lore. It happened, or it was done to them, and they have been living inside the arrangement long enough that it no longer seems to require explanation from their perspective. The Albinoric archer Latenna and the wolf she was also Latenna travels toward the Helic tree, or rather she directs you toward it, because Latenna cannot walk easily. The first generation Albinoric body, with its underdeveloped lower limbs, makes independent travel across the distances the lands between requires nearly impossible without assistance. Her companion and mount was a wolf named Lobo, and they traveled together until Lobo's death, after which Latenna could no longer move freely through the world. You find Lobo's body before you find Latenna. You find her grief after. Their relationship exceeded the practical, exceeded the category of rider and mount, exceeded even what is typically described as friendship.
Intruder.
Some theories propose that Albinoric existence involves a deeper binding between individual and companion than human existence does. A genuine symbiosis in which Lobo and Latenna were, in a meaningful sense, one creature distributed between two bodies, each carrying aspects of their shared existence that the other could not. In this reading, Lobo's death did not simply inconvenience Latenna. It removed half of what she was.
Unchanged.
Her willingness to be summoned as a spirit ash after her own death, to continue serving as a guide, an archer from beyond the veil, might be continuous with this dynamic, a being that has always understood itself as part of something larger than one body choosing to extend that understanding into the afterlife, rather than include it. She continues to beneath the civilization, below the capital city, extending through a drainage and waste management system far too elaborate for simple infrastructure. The sewers of Lendel contain altars, shrines, the lingering presence of the Frenzied Flame, and the evidence of people who lived there, not just passed through, lived. The Forsaken Depths and the areas connected to them have the quality of a neighborhood that was never acknowledged by the city above, a subterranean population existing in permanent proximity to the Golden Order's seat of power without being included in its structure. The architectural quality of the sewer system itself tells you that it was built with care and permanence by someone who expected it to last. Drainage infrastructure of that quality requires planning, resources, and a decision to invest in the long-term maintenance of a system that serves an existing population. Who commissioned this construction? The city above, presumably, but cities commission sewers for the city, and what's underneath Lendel feels like it was designed as much for habitation as for drainage. Perhaps the sewers were always a second city, built parallel to the first one, serving a population that the Golden Order's surface civilization officially did not include, but practically could not function without. The merchants, the laborers, the Roman children hidden by their families before they could be mutilated, practitioners of prohibited faiths, everyone the capital city contained, but preferred not to acknowledge finding their way down to a parallel infrastructure that the city's surface simply tried not to think about. The Glintstone mines, and the moment they stop the Academy of Raya Lucaria, depends on glintstone for its magic. Glintstone is the material through which sorcery operates, the medium in which arcane knowledge is encoded and transmitted. And the glintstone deposits in the region are described as running low.
My loyal blade.
You can see this in the mines and caverns of Liurnia, where glintstone clusters are sparse and heavily guarded, extracted with a care that suggests awareness of scarcity.
Now,
what happens when the material runs out? The Academy has no clear answer, or at least no answer it has chosen to make public. The sorcery tradition it represents might not survive the depletion of its foundational resource. Techniques that require glintstone would become impossible to practice, then impossible to teach, then gradually impossible to remember in the detail required for transmission, and eventually lost entirely. The glintstone dragons, who are hunted for their crystallized arms, represent as a secondary resource, but hunting them to extinction solves the immediate shortage, while guaranteeing their future. The Academy's entire existence is built on the region's aim, the final resource, the civilization is not visible. The history of the world is filled with societies that built themselves on resources they believed were permanent and discovered the assumption was wrong only when the resource was already nearly gone. The Academy of Raya Lucaria may be in the process of discovering this, too slowly for the knowledge to be of much practical use. The sacred tears and the prayers they crystallized golden teardrops rest in churches across the lands between, enhancing the sacred flask when gathered. They are described as tears that fell from the Erd tree, condensations of divine grace made physically tangible. If the Erd tree can cry, and if its tears carry concentrated divine power, then the churches that contain the are sites where the god expressed something that left physical evidence, not a decree or an instruction, a feeling. The Erd tree, or whatever operates through it, responded to something in these specific locations with an emotional intensity sufficient to produce divine tears, and those tears crystallized and persisted while the feeling that produced them faded. What was happening in these churches that prompted this response? Perhaps devoted prayer over long periods produced an accumulation of faith so concentrated that the Erd tree wept at it, something genuine, reaching to God's awareness in a way that ordinary devotion did not. Or perhaps the tears fell at moments of divine distress, the god registering something in the world's unfolding that prompted genuine grief, and these churches happened to be in the path of the falling tears. The scarcity of the tears, compared to the number of churches, suggests not all locations produce this response. Only some, only under conditions that occurred rarely enough that the tears each represent something specific that was felt once and preserved permanently, small physical records of moments when the divine was moved by something in the world below it. The round table holds table, and the council that never met. At the center of the round table hold stands the round table that gives the location its name. It is a large table, old-looking, positioned to be the center of activity in the space, and nobody sits at it. The NPCs gather in the hold's various rooms. They stand near the fireplace. They occupy corners. They approach you individually for conversations that serve their personal quests. But the table itself, the obvious gathering point, the piece of furniture whose entire purpose is to bring people together in a coordinated way, sits empty in the middle of every visit. This is either an accident of game design or a very deliberate piece of environmental storytelling, and given the care with which the rest of the hold's details are constructed, the emptiness seems intentional. The table is a monument to the cooperation that was always theoretically available to the Tarnished and never a round table has no head.
It's been
That's the point
a
of the
long
round
while,
table as a symbol,
Mohg.
going back as far as the metaphor exists in human culture. Everyone who sits at it is equal. Everyone has the same claim to be heard. The hold could have been a place where the Tarnished compared their discoveries, toured their
Tarnished
knowledge,
warrior,
made collective decisions
spurned
about
by
how
the
to
grace
approach
of
the
gold.
Erdtree. The table was there for exactly this purpose, and the Tarnished who gathered around
the
it,
Elden
driven by
Ring
individual ambition
resteth
and mutual
close at
mistrust,
hand.
and the competitive structure the Grace's guidance created, chose instead to circle the table without ever sitting down, each pursuing their own ending, while the possibility of a shared one sat at the center of the room, patient and unused, exactly as round tables always wait. So the questions accumulate, one after another,
To be
the lands
granted
between
audience
generating
once
mysteries
more.
faster than any single. The world is built this way on purpose. The gaps are not oversights. The silences are not laziness.
Upon my
They are
name
the
as
shape of a
Godfrey,
game that was never meant to be fully understood.
the first Elden Lord.
Moved through in the dark with a flask and a blade, whatever Grace chooses to create. There are always more questions, like, that is not God. That is the world being honest about what the world is like. Rest now, Tarnished. The unanswered things will wait. They are very good at waiting. The lands between has given them all the time in the world. The
Thou
Mimic
didst
Tear,
me
the
good
identity it
service.
bars from you. In the depths of
Sirach.
Milkron, you fight the Mimic Tear. Your weapons, your armor, your spells, your learning abilities. The silver tears throughout the eternal cities are shapeshifters, beings of liquid metal that model themselves on what they encounter. But the Mimic Tear boss goes further than copying appearance. It fights the way you fight. It uses your abilities in the specific ways
I've
you have
given
been
thee
using them, which
courtesy
implies it has
enough.
been watching you, or that it has access to information about you that a simple visual impression where this information comes from is the mystery. The Erdtree tracks the Tarnished through grace. If the Mimic Tear has access to whatever system the Erdtree
Now I
uses to
fight
monitor
with
grace-guided
horror.
individuals, it is drawing on divine infrastructure to copy you. The implication would be that the Nox,
Tarnished,
created the Silver
thy
Tears,
strength.
had enough understanding of how the Erdtree's information systems work to tap into them and use that information for their own constructs. This is consistent with the Nox's documented interest in defying and studying the greater will systems. Creating a creature that borrows from divine tracking systems to produce perfect copies would be a deeply heretical application of knowledge the greater will considered proprietary. The Mimic Tear is perhaps the closest thing to a successful version of what the Fingerslayer blade attempted, not killing the two fingers, but using their master's own infrastructure against itself, making a mockery of the divine record-keeping by turning it into a mirror. The ancestor spirits and the cycle they remember, the great deer of light that the ancestral followers summon through their rituals, are ancient beings, or aspects of ancient beings, that embody something about the underground's relationship to the life cycle. Fighting them produces their essence, which can be returned to the Erd Tree or to whatever underground cosmological system they serve. They are composed of light in the shape of deer, which is a specific combination of imagery. Light suggests divinity, or at least spiritual significance, and deer are traditionally associated with the cycle of seasons, with transition between states, with the liminal quality of creatures that move between forest and clearing, between visible and hidden. The ancestral followers worship them as divine beings, worthy of reverence, and periodically worthy of sacrifice, which is an interesting theological position, since sacrifice typically involves giving up something the worshippers value. Killing an ancestor spirit in this framework is not destruction, but transformation, sending the being through a transition that is understood as part of the cycle rather than as termination. This is a death theology entirely unlike the Golden Order's rebirth system, and entirely unlike the Frenzied Flame's dissolution philosophy. It is a third cosmological position, older than either of the other two, that treats death as a ritual passage in an ongoing cycle rather than either a temporary interruption of life or a merging with undifferentiated chaos. The ancestral followers have been practicing this theology underground for longer than anyone has been paying attention to them, and they will continue practicing it after whatever happens on the surface resolves itself, because their cosmology is not dependent on any of the structures that are currently in the process of breaking. The death roots spread, and Gurank's hunger that explains itself, the beast clergyman. Gurank waits in Bestial Sanctum, devouring deathroot that you bring him in exchange for teaching you incantations. His hunger for the material is visceral and barely controlled. He attacks you briefly after consuming enough of it before catching himself, the corruption he is consuming momentarily, overcoming whatever control he exercises over his own reactions. Later, you discover that Gurank and Malika are the same being, the shadow beast who sealed away Destined Death, now consuming the very material generated by that sealing's imperfect consequences. This is a creature eating the byproduct of its own greatest act, metabolizing the fallout of the decision that defined its existence. Whether this is penance, practical necessity, or something the game intends as ironic is genuinely unclear. The hunger itself is the mystery. Why would Malika, of all beings, crave deathroot? If he sealed Destined Death within himself, the presence of deathroot in the world represents a kind of external version of what he carries internally. Perhaps consuming it is the shadow beast's attempt to bring all the death taint back inside himself, to reabsorb what escaped, to complete the sealing that was never quite total. Or perhaps The death root is simply calling to what he carries. Two halves of the same power, recognizing each other across the distance between them. The hunger, not a desire for the root itself, but an irresistible pull towards something that shares its nature with the most fundamental thing Malekith has ever been asked to hold. So the fire dies down, and the questions remain, as they always do in the lands between. These mysteries are not failures of the storytelling. They are the storytelling. They are the spaces where your imagination is trusted with something the game considers too important to simply explain. Every unsolved question is an invitation. Every shadow the lore casts without defining its source is a door left open on purpose. Rest now, Tarnished. The lands between will still be there. Its secrets will still be waiting. If these mysteries carried you somewhere restful tonight, leave a comment and tell me which one stayed with you, and subscribe so the next journey finds you easily.